close your eyes and imagine an ocean. Not the ocean you know, not the ocean of cargo ships and plastic bottles and GPS coordinates and satellite imagery. Not the ocean of surfers and fishing boats and the familiar silhouettes of coastlines that have been mapped down to the last centimeter. Imagine an ocean that has never been mapped. An ocean that no human eye has ever seen. An ocean that covers more of the earth than today's seas do. Warmer and shallower in many places. Its chemistry different from anything alive today. Its surface broken by island chains and shallow epicontinental seas that spread across what are now dry continents, and beneath its surface, beneath the glittering, warm, oxygen-rich surface, a world of animals so large and so strange and so perfectly adapted to ruling the seas that their like has not been seen since the day they vanished. This is the ocean of the Mesozoic era, the ocean of the age of reptiles. And it was ruled for over 150 million years by creatures that were not fish and not whales and not anything that exists today. They were reptiles, air-breathing, warm or cool-blooded depending on the species, descended from ancestors that had once lived on land, that had returned to the sea, and in doing so, had become something that the land could never have produced. Something adapted to an environment of 3 dimensions, of pressure and darkness and current and the vast horizontal spaces of open water, that had been shaped by evolution into forms of such physical power and such ecological dominance that they ruled the marine world from the Triassic period through to the very end of the Cretaceous. Their names are less famous than T-Rex. Their bones appear in fewer children's books. The museums that house their skeletons draw smaller crowds than those that exhibit the great sauropods or the horned dinosaurs of the land. But they were every bit as extraordinary, every bit as extraordinary, every bit as alive. Tonight, we go into their world. Before we meet the animals themselves, we need to understand the world they lived in, because the oceans of the Mesozoic era were not simply older versions of the oceans we know. They were different in ways that shaped every aspect of the biology and behavior of the creatures that inhabited them. The Mesozoic era spans roughly 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago. From the end of the Permian mass extinction to the end Cretaceous extinction that ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs, it is divided into 3 periods: the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous. Each period had its own configuration of continents, its own climate, its own cast of marine reptiles occupying the apex predator roles in the sea. At the beginning of the Mesozoic, the continents were assembled into a single supercontinent called Pangaea, surrounded by a single vast global ocean called Panthalassa. This ocean was immense, stretching nearly halfway around the planet, covering an area far larger than any ocean that exists today. Its size meant that the winds that drove its circulation were enormous, generating currents of comparable scale, and that the deep ocean basins were far from continental shelves in ways that affected the distribution of nutrients and the productivity of the surface waters. As the Mesozoic progressed, Pangaea began to break apart. The Atlantic Ocean opened. The Tethys Sea, a warm, shallow, tropical seaway that stretched across what is now southern Europe and Central Asia, expanded and diversified. By the Cretaceous period, the breakup of the continents had created a configuration of shallow epicontinental seas covering large portions of what are now the continental interiors of North America, Europe, and Asia. The Western Interior Seaway divided North America from north to south. the Tethys Sea lapped at the shores of what would become the Alps and the Himalayas. The world's coastlines were longer, the shallow water environments more extensive, and the global ocean more productive than at almost any other time in Earth's history. The climate of the Mesozoic was, for most of its duration, warmer than today's. There were no permanent polar ice caps. The poles were cold but ice-free for much of the era, and the temperature gradient from equator to pole was less steep than it is now. Sea surface temperatures in the tropics were significantly warmer than those of today's tropical oceans, and warm, nutrient-rich water circulated more freely between latitudes. The consequence was a marine biosphere of extraordinary productivity, enormous blooms of planktonic life supporting food chains of great complexity and abundance. This was the environment into which the marine reptiles evolved, diversified, and for over 150 million years dominated. They did not do this by accident. They did it because the sea offered something the land could never quite match: space, unlimited, three-dimensional, food-rich space. An apex predator on land is constrained by topography, by the need to compete for territory, by the energy cost of locomotion over uneven surfaces. An apex predator in the open ocean moves in all directions, is limited in its range only by its own physiology, and can exploit prey concentrations that shift with currents and seasons. The sea rewards large body size in a way the land does not. And the marine reptiles of the Mesozoic grew large. The story of Mesozoic marine reptiles begins not with the giants of popular imagination, but with much smaller and more modest ancestors, animals that were making the transition from land to sea in the early Triassic period, roughly 250 million years ago, in the aftermath of the greatest mass extinction the world has ever experienced, the Permian-Triassic extinction, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago, eliminated an estimated 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. It was a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale, a biological collapse so severe that the recovery of marine ecosystems took millions of years. The oceans in the early Triassic were, by geological standards, nearly empty. The ecological niches that had been filled by hundreds of thousands of species were suddenly vacant. Into this vacancy, the vertebrates that survived the extinction began to expand. Among the terrestrial survivors were small, agile reptiles, animals capable of exploiting the rich marine environments along the early Triassic shorelines, where food was abundant and competition was limited. Some of these animals began spending more time in the water. Their bodies began to change. The limbs that had carried them across dry land gradually became more effective as paddles. The body shape that had been optimized for terrestrial locomotion was reshaped over generations and then millions of years into something suited to the water. This is the process of secondary marine adaptation, the return of a terrestrial vertebrate lineage to the sea, and it has happened multiple times independently in the history of life. Whales are descended from terrestrial mammals. Marine iguanas still make daily excursions between land and sea. Sea turtles retain the memory of the land and their compulsion to return to beaches to nest. In the Mesozoic, at least 4 distinct groups of reptiles made this transition independently: the Ichthyosaurs, the Plesiosaurs and their relatives, the Mosasaurs, and various smaller groups including the Thalattosuchians and the Placodonts. Each lineage took a different evolutionary path from its terrestrial ancestor. Each produced a different body plan, a different set of adaptations, a different suite of ecological strategies for surviving and succeeding in the marine environment, and each dominated the seas during a different portion of the Mesozoic, with the rise of one group sometimes overlapping with and occasionally displacing another. The result, over the full span of the Mesozoic, was a succession of marine apex predators that rivals anything the land ever produced for sheer biological drama. We begin with the Ichthyosaurs, because they were first. The Ichthyosaurs, whose name means fish lizards, though they were neither fish nor lizards, appeared in the early Triassic, shortly after the Permian extinction, and persisted for approximately 160 million years, finally going extinct in the early late Cretaceous, roughly 90 million years ago. They are, by duration, among the most successful groups of large marine vertebrates that have ever existed. They outlasted many of the other groups that rose and fell in the Mesozoic seas. They witnessed the rise of the dinosaurs on land and continued through the Jurassic while the great sauropods walked the earth. And then, quietly, they faded, outcompeted, or environmentally disrupted, approximately 25 million years before the asteroid that ended the Cretaceous arrived. The early Ichthyosaurs were not the streamlined, dolphin-like animals that later members of the group would become. They were more eel-like, long-bodied, sinuous, with limbs that still retained much of their terrestrial structure. They swam by lateral undulation, flexing the body from side to side as a fish does, and they were probably capable hunters of fish and invertebrates in the shallow coastal waters of the early Triassic. But the group evolved rapidly. Within tens of millions of years, Ichthyosaurs had diversified into a remarkable range of body forms and ecological roles, and some of them had grown very large indeed. The most astonishing example is Shonosaurus siganiensis, known from remains found in British Columbia, Canada. This animal, which lived in the late Triassic, approximately 210 million years ago, was estimated from its partial skeleton to have been approximately 21 meters long. 21 meters. Longer than a sperm whale? It would have been one of the largest animals ever to have lived at that point in Earth's history. What did this giant eat? Its skull was elongated and relatively lightly built compared to the massive skull of a sperm whale or the armored skull of later giant predators. The teeth present in younger, smaller members of the Ichthyosaur family, but apparently reduced or absent in the very largest, and the overall shape of the jaws in some specimens have led researchers to speculate that the very largest ichthyosaurs may have been suction feeders, drawing in soft-bodied prey like squids the way a sperm whale draws in fish rather than seizing prey with visible teeth. But this interpretation remains debated, and the feeding ecology of the largest Triassic ichthyosaurs is one of the genuinely open questions in marine paleontology. By the Jurassic period, the dominant ichthyosaurs had converged on the sleek, streamlined body form that makes them so instantly recognizable. The Jurassic genus Ichthyosaurus, the animal that gave the group its name and that provided some of the first specimens described by science, was a relatively modest-sized animal, perhaps 2 to 3 meters long, built with a body plan so similar to that of a modern dolphin that it is almost startling. Large crescent-shaped tail fin for propulsion, dorsal fin for stability, flippers derived from the heavily modified bones of arms and hands, large eyes, streamlined head. These convergences with modern dolphins and porpoises are not coincidental. They reflect the same evolutionary pressures acting on bodies adapted to the same physical environment. Fast locomotion in open water rewards the same body shapes regardless of the taxon. The laws of fluid dynamics are the same in the Jurassic as they are today, and evolution found the same solutions, but the similarities can mislead. Ichthyosaurs were not dolphins. They were reptiles, air breathers, descendants of terrestrial ancestors, with a nervous system and sensory apparatus and behavioral repertoire that were built on a reptilian rather than mammalian foundation. Their experience of the ocean, if we can speak of such a thing, was filtered through a fundamentally different kind of biology than that of any cetacean. The eyes of ichthyosaurs deserve particular attention because they are one of the most extraordinary features of any extinct animal. Mosasaurus, a genus of Jurassic ichthyosaur, found widely across Europe and North America, had eyes that were relative to body size, the largest of any known vertebrate. The eye of Ichthyosaurs was roughly 23 centimeters in diameter. For an animal approximately 6 meters long, this is a remarkable proportion, far larger than the eyes of any living animal of comparable size and larger in absolute terms than those of most animals of any size. Why such enormous eyes? The answer lies in physics and ecology. Large eyes gather more light. An eye 23 centimeters in diameter can gather orders of magnitude more light than a human eye or the eye of a dolphin of comparable body size. This capability is valuable in one specific set of circumstances: hunting in low light. Where was there low light in the Jurassic Ocean? At depth, below the photic zone, where sunlight fades and the light available for vision diminishes rapidly. Ichthyosaurus, with eyes adapted to function in near darkness, was almost certainly a deep-diving predator, an animal capable of descending to the light-poor depths of the Jurassic Sea to hunt squid or fish that took refuge there during the day. CT scanning of Ichthyosaurus eye bones has revealed a further adaptation, a sclerotic ring, a ring of small bones within the eye itself that supported the eye structure against the deforming pressure of a deep dive. This bone ring is found in birds and reptiles, and in Ichthyosaurus, it is robust enough to suggest that the eye could maintain its shape at considerable depths where the pressure would otherwise compress and distort an unsupported eye structure. Deep diving capability in ichthyosaurs has been further supported by studies of bone tissue. Some ichthyosaur specimens show evidence of decompression-related bone pathologies, the same type of damage seen in human divers who ascend too rapidly from depth. The bends, essentially. An animal showing the bone damage of decompression sickness is an animal that spent time at significant depth. It is an indirect but compelling line of evidence that ichthyosaurs were not merely coastal shallow water predators, but were venturing into the deep ocean in search of prey. One of the most remarkable windows into ichthyosaur biology comes not from bones, but from exceptional soft tissue preservation. Several ichthyosaur specimens, particularly from the Holzmaden deposits of Germany, preserve the outline of the body in carbonized skin impressions, allowing scientists to see the actual shape of the animal in life rather than inferring it from bones alone. These impressions confirm the presence of the dorsal fin and the bilobed tail fin that the bone structure alone had suggested, but had not proven. And in 2018, an analysis of a remarkably well-preserved Stenopterygeus specimen from Holzmaden went further still. Using advanced chemical analysis techniques, researchers were able to identify traces of melanosomes, the cellular structures that contain pigment preserved in the skin of the fossil. The results suggested that ichthyosaurs were countershaded, dark on the dorsal surface, lighter on the ventral surface, in the same basic pattern seen in modern marine predators like dolphins and sharks. Counterpart from above, lighter from below, a camouflage strategy that works in the open ocean regardless of the century. The Ichthyosaurs were not simply bones. They were colored, they had pigment. They moved through the Jurassic seas in bodies that were, in their external appearance, convergent with the marine predators of today in ways that even the most optimistic paleontologist would not have predicted a generation ago. Now, we turn to the animals that, for many people, define the monsters of the ancient seas, the plesiosaurs. The plesiosaurs are a group of marine reptiles that appear in the fossil record at the very end of the Triassic period, approximately 203 million years ago, and persist all the way to the end Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago. They are, alongside the Ichthyosaurs, the longest-running dynasty of Mesozoic marine reptiles, and their range of body forms is extraordinary. The popular image of the plesiosaur, derived from the reconstructions that have adorned natural history books for nearly 2 centuries, is of a long-necked, small-headed, barrel-bodied animal with 4 large paddle-like flippers and a relatively short tail. This image is not wrong, exactly, but it describes only one branch of the plesiosaur family tree. The group as a whole was far more varied. Plesiosaurs are divided into 2 major groups that have superficially very different body plans. The plesiosaurs in the strict sense, sometimes called plesiosauroids, are the long-necked forms. Their necks could be extraordinary, in the most extreme cases, accounting for more than half the total body length of the animal, built from dozens of individual neck vertebrae arranged in a graceful, flexible column. The head at the end of this neck was typically small and armed with interlocking needle-like teeth, a design well suited to catching fish and squid by snapping sideways through shoals of prey. The other major group, the Plesiosaurids, had the reverse proportions: large, massive heads on short necks, with bodies still dominated by those 4 powerful flippers, but with jaws that were weapons rather than the delicate fish-catching instruments of the long-necked forms. The Plesiosaurids were the apex predators among the plesiosaurs, the animals whose jaws could close on prey of any size with devastating force, whose hunting range extended to the largest and most dangerous animals in the Jurassic seas. It is the Plesiosaurids that most deserve, in the literal sense of the word, the title of sea monsters, largely because of its starring role in a television documentary series at the turn of the millennium that depicted it at a somewhat exaggerated scale. But the real animal, stripped of the exaggeration, needs no embellishment. Liopleurodon lived in the late Jurassic, approximately 160 to 155 million years ago, in the shallow epicontinental sea that covered much of what is now Western Europe, a warm, productive island-dotted sea that preserved an extraordinary diversity of marine life. Much of it now known from the famous Oxfordshire clay deposits of England and equivalent formations in France and Germany. The largest Liopleurodon specimens represent animals perhaps 6 to 7 meters in length, not the 25 meters suggested by the television depiction, but large enough to be formidable predators in any company. The skull alone could reach over 1 meter in length, massive and reinforced, with teeth that were conical, robust, and deeply rooted, built not for slicing but for gripping and holding large prey that struggled and fought. The jaw mechanics of Liopleurodon have been studied in detail, and the results are striking. The bite force generated by those massive jaws was enormous. comparable, in some estimates, to that of large theropod dinosaurs. The teeth, when they closed, interlocked in a pattern that would have prevented prey from sliding forward or backward out of the grip. An animal seized by a Liopleurodon was not going to pull free by struggling. What did Liopleurodon eat? The sea in which it lived was full of suitable prey. Large Ichthyosaurs shared the water with it. Smaller Plesiosaurs were present. Fish, ammonites, the abundant cephalopods of the Jurassic Sea would have been accessible. The tooth marks on the bones of other marine reptiles, found occasionally in Jurassic deposits, tell us that the large Plesiosaurs were eating each other's relatives and possibly each other. Liopleurodon moved through this environment on 4 large flippers using an underwater flight motion that has been the subject of significant biomechanical study. Unlike a fish, which propels itself with a tail, or an ichthyosaur, which used a crescent-shaped tail fin, the Plesiosaurs and plesiosaur generated thrust primarily from their flippers, 4 broad, powerful paddles working in coordinated strokes to drive the body through the water. Computer modeling of this locomotion suggests that the animals were efficient cruisers rather than explosive sprinters, capable of sustained movement at modest speeds, with the ability to accelerate for short bursts during prey pursuit. The 4-flipper system gives plesiosaurs a distinctive look that has contributed to their endurance in the popular imagination. It is also, biomechanically, a system without a close modern analog. No living animal uses 4 flippers in quite the same way. And reconstructing the details of how plesiosaurs coordinated their flipper strokes has required innovative modeling approaches that are still generating new results. There is a fossil site in the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, a cluster of islands in the Arctic Ocean, so far north that the sun does not set for months in summer and does not rise for months in winter, where, embedded in rocks that were once the floor of a warm Jurassic Sea, the bones of sea monsters have been emerging for decades. The site is called Svalbard, and the animals found there have transformed our understanding of what the Mesozoic ocean was actually like. Not the tidy, predictable world of popular reconstruction, where familiar animals occupy familiar roles in a familiar ecology. Something wilder, something that, when you follow the evidence carefully, reveals a world of ecological violence and biological excess that makes the modern ocean seem almost peaceful by comparison. Among the animals found in Svalbard is one that was nicknamed, when it was first being excavated and studied, Predator X. The formal name, assigned after full scientific description, is Plesiosaurus funke. But Predator X captures something that the Latin binomial does not: the quality of alarm, of genuine astonishment, that the researchers who excavated and measured this animal experienced. Because Plesiosaurus funke was large, very large, larger in the proportions of its skull and jaws and limb girdles than almost anything the Jurassic seas had produced. The estimates for the body length of the largest Plesiosaurus funke specimens range from 10 to 13 meters, the uncertainty reflecting the fragmentary nature of the material, since complete skeletons of very large plesiosaurs are exceedingly rare. The skull alone, based on the material recovered, was approximately 2 meters long. 2 meters, the length of a tall man, made entirely of bone, reinforced for the delivery of enormous biting force, equipped with teeth that were not simply large but conical and robust in a way that spoke unmistakably of an animal that bit large prey and held on. The bite force of Plesiosaurus funke has been estimated at approximately 15 tons of force, 15,000 kilograms applied through those conical teeth to whatever they closed upon. To put this in perspective, the bite force of a large saltwater crocodile, the animal with the strongest bite force among living reptiles, is approximately 1.5 tons. The bite force of Plesiosaurus funke was 10 times greater. Imagine that. 10 times the bite force of the most powerful biting animal alive today, delivered through a skull 2 meters long, by an animal that weighed somewhere between 12 and 45 tons, depending on which estimates you accept. Moving through a warm Jurassic Sea on 4 enormous flippers, in water that was once as far north as the Arctic, but that, in the Jurassic, was warm enough to support a thriving marine ecosystem of the kind that today we associate with tropical and subtropical latitudes. What did Predator X eat? Almost certainly anything it chose to. The bite marks left on the bones of other large marine reptiles, Ichthyosaurs, other Plesiosaurs, found in the same deposits as Plesiosaurus funke, are consistent with the tooth dimensions of a large pliosaur. This is direct fossil evidence that the large plesiosaurids were preying on other large marine reptiles, not just fish, not just squid. Other top predators, animals that were themselves formidable hunters that would have resisted and fought, were on the menu of Predator X. This gives us a window into the ecological dynamics of the Jurassic Ocean that is both fascinating and sobering. The apex predator of the Jurassic Sea was not simply at the top of a food chain built on fish and invertebrates. It was at the top of a food chain built on other apex predators. A hierarchical cascade of predation in which the animals at each level were themselves large, powerful, and dangerous, and in which the apex predator was something so large and so powerful that no other animal in the sea could challenge it. This is what the Jurassic Ocean actually was. Not a peaceful, sunlit world of graceful, long-necked animals gliding through clear water. An arena, a world of predators and prey in which the scale of both the hunters and the hunted exceeded anything the modern ocean contains. Alongside the pliosauroids, the long-necked plesiosaurs occupied a very different ecological role, one that has been the subject of persistent scientific debate about how these animals actually functioned as predators. The long neck of the elasmosaurids, the most extremely long-necked members of the plesiosauroid line, is an anatomical feature that has puzzled scientists since the first specimens were described in the 19th century. An elasmosaurid like Elasmosaurus Plesiosaurs, described from North America in 1868 by Edward Drinker Cope, had a neck containing 71 vertebrae and accounting for more than half the animal's total body length of approximately 10 to 12 meters. The body was relatively compact, the tail was short, and most of the animal was neck. What was this neck for? The most intuitive hypothesis that the long neck allowed elasmosaurids to strike rapidly at fish, snapping the head sideways through shoals of prey, like a heron striking from above, has been tested against the anatomy and found to be problematic. The vertebral joints of elasmosaurid necks, when examined carefully, show limited flexibility. The neck could swing from side to side to a degree, and it could be held in a gentle curve, but it was not a serpentine, highly flexible structure capable of rapid lateral strikes. It was more like a long, relatively stiff boom, capable of being positioned in space at different angles, but not of the rapid, strike-like movements the heron analogy implies. An alternative hypothesis suggests that the long neck was used for stealth, that an elasmosaurid could approach a shoal of fish or squid from below with its large body at depth and only its long, slender neck rising through the water toward the prey. The profile of the neck, seen from the side by a fish looking down, would have been far less alarming than the approach of a large body. The small head at the end of the neck could then snap at prey before the shoal scattered. This hypothesis is intriguing and has some support from the overall body design of elasmosaurids, but it too has problems, particularly with the mechanics of how the animal would have maneuvered in 3 dimensions while keeping its body concealed and its neck extended upward. A third hypothesis, which has gained traction in recent years, focuses on the bottom. Some researchers have proposed that elasmosaurids were benthic foragers, animals that used their long necks to probe the seafloor for invertebrates, sweeping the head through soft sediments in search of buried prey. The preserved stomach contents of some plesiosaur specimens, including gastroliths, swallowed stones that may have helped with buoyancy regulation or with grinding food, and fragments of invertebrate shell, are consistent with a diet that included bottom-dwelling prey. The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty exactly how elasmosaurids use their extraordinary necks. The fossils give us the anatomy. They give us the stomach contents of a few lucky specimens. They give us the environmental context, but the behavior itself, the moment-to-moment activity of a living elasmosaurid moving through the Cretaceous Sea, is beyond direct observation. What we can say is that whatever those necks were for, they worked. Elasmosaurids were extraordinarily successful animals, persisting for tens of millions of years across multiple ocean basins, diversifying into dozens of species and surviving until the very end Cretaceous extinction that eliminated all non-avian dinosaurs and all remaining non-avian marine reptiles simultaneously. The neck, whatever its precise function, was not a liability. It was one of the most remarkable pieces of paleontological evidence concerning plesiosaur biology does not come from bones or teeth or trackways. It comes from the inside of a plesiosaur. In 1987, a specimen of Polycotylus latipinus, a relatively small, short-necked plesiosaur, was excavated from the Pierre Shale of Kansas, a geological formation that preserves the remains of the western interior seaway, the shallow Cretaceous Sea that divided North America from north to south. The specimen was unusual from the beginning. It was large, its bones were robust, and within the body cavity, arranged in what appeared to be a natural position, were the bones of a second, much smaller individual. For years, the interpretation of this specimen was uncertain. Was the smaller individual's stomach contents prey that the larger animal had consumed? Or was it something else? Full preparation and analysis of the specimen, published in 2011, resolved the question. The smaller individual was not prey. It was a fetus, an unborn Polycotylus, preserved inside the body of its mother at the moment of her death. This single specimen overturned a long-standing assumption about plesiosaur reproduction. Because plesiosaurs had paddle-shaped flippers rather than functional hind limbs capable of dragging their bodies onto land, many paleontologists had assumed, by analogy with sea turtles, the best living analog, that plesiosaurs must have come ashore to nest, laying eggs on beaches and leaving the eggs to develop unattended as sea turtles do. But the anatomy of large plesiosaurs made this increasingly implausible. Getting a multi-tone plesiosaur out of the water and onto a beach would have been extraordinarily difficult. Moving across dry land without functional limbs and then returning to the sea would have been nearly impossible for the larger species. The Polycotylus specimen settled the debate. Plesiosaurs gave live birth. They were viviparous, carrying their young inside the body until the offspring was developed enough to survive independently in the ocean. And the size of the fetus relative to the mother, approximately the size that would be expected if only a single offspring was being carried, rather than the multiple smaller offspring of an egg clutch strategy, suggests that plesiosaurs may have invested heavily in individual offspring, as many large marine mammals do today. This has profound implications for our understanding of plesiosaur social life. Animals that give birth to large, single offspring and invest heavily in those offspring tend, in the living world, to be animals with extended periods of parental care. A plesiosaur mother that had carried a single large offspring through a long pregnancy was almost certainly not going to abandon that offspring immediately at birth. The investment was too large. The offspring was too vulnerable. Direct evidence of plesiosaur parental care is difficult to obtain from the fossil record. The behaviors involved would leave little durable trace. But the reproductive biology revealed by the polycotylus specimen is consistent with a level of social and parental complexity that the old reptile model, lay eggs and walk away, had failed to consider. Plesiosaurs, the evidence increasingly suggests, had family lives. They had young that needed care. They may have traveled in groups as some large marine mammals do, in part because group living provides protection for vulnerable offspring. They were not simply large, solitary predators moving through a featureless ocean. They were animals embedded in social structures, however simple those structures may have been, that shaped their behavior and ecology in ways we are only beginning to appreciate. The Cretaceous period brought new actors onto the stage of the ancient seas, while the plesiosaurs and, until about 90 million years ago, the Ichthyosaurs continued to occupy the seas. A new group of marine reptiles was emerging that would, in the final 20 million years of the Mesozoic, come to dominate the ocean in a way that no previous group had managed. These were the Mosasaurs. The Mosasaurs are, in the history of vertebrate paleontology, almost as old as the science itself. The first Mosasaur specimen to be studied scientifically, a large skull recovered from the chalk mines of Maastricht in what is now the Netherlands in the 1760s and 1760s, was one of the first large fossil vertebrates to be systematically examined by European scientists, and the debates over its identity and affinities presaged the development of paleontology as a discipline. Napoleon Bonaparte famously had the Maastricht skull transported to Paris as a war trophy after the French conquest of the Netherlands in 1795, where it eventually ended up in what is now the Natural History Museum of Paris. The animal the skull belonged to was eventually named Mosasaurus hoffmanni, the lizard of the Meuse, after the river near which it was found, and it has given its name to the entire group. The Mosasaurs. What were the Mosasaurs? They were lizards, specifically members of the squamate family that includes the modern monitor lizards and the Gila monster, making them close relatives of the snakes as well as the monitors. They were not dinosaurs. They were not plesiosaurs. They were lizards that had returned to the sea in a transition that began in the mid-Cretaceous and that, by the end of the period, had produced some of the most formidable marine predators the world has ever seen. The transition from land to sea in the Mosasaur lineage is documented in fragmentary but informative form by animals like Dilophosaurus turneri, a small lizard-like mosasaur from Texas dating to approximately 92 million years ago. Dilophosaurus retained functional limbs, not yet the broad paddles of later Mosasaurs, but recognizable legs with functional joints, and was probably capable of moving on land as well as in water. It was, in size and in appearance, not dramatically different from a large modern monitor lizard. If you had encountered it on a Cretaceous beach, you might have recognized it as something lizard-like, something familiar in its general outline before noticing the details of its anatomy that marked it as something transitional, something in the process of becoming a sea monster. From Dilophosaurus, the Mosasaur lineage evolved with startling rapidity. Within 20 million years, an eye blink in geological terms, the Mosasaurid family had produced animals that were no longer transitional in any meaningful sense. They were fully committed to the sea. Their limbs had transformed into flippers. Their tails had developed flukes, similar in function to the tail fins of fish and sharks, for propulsion. Their bodies had become hydrodynamically streamlined, and they had grown large, very large. The diversification of the Mosasaurs in the late Cretaceous coincided almost exactly with the decline of the Ichthyosaurs, which went extinct approximately 90 million years ago. Whether the Mosasaurs caused or contributed to the Ichthyosaurs' extinction, or whether the Ichthyosaurs declined for independent reasons, changes in prey availability, changes in ocean chemistry, competition from other predators, is a question that paleontology has not yet definitively answered. What is clear is that as the Ichthyosaurs disappeared, the Mosasaurs expanded to fill the ecological space they had vacated, diversifying rapidly into a wide range of sizes and feeding specializations. By 70 million years ago, the Mosasaurs were the undisputed rulers of the Cretaceous seas. They were found in every ocean basin. They ranged from small, nimble hunters barely 2 meters long to oceanic giants 10 meters or more in length. They had diversified into ecological roles as varied as any group of marine predators before or since: fish hunters, mollusk crushers, sea turtle specialists, and open ocean pursuit predators capable of taking prey of considerable size. And then, 66 million years ago, they were gone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we witness the end, we need to spend more time with the animals in the fullness of their existence. Because the Mosasaurs, in their 20 million years of dominance, were not simply large predators. They were a world of their own, diverse, behaviorally complex, ecologically varied in ways that a simple list of species cannot capture. The largest Mosasaurs are the ones that dominate the imagination, and rightly so. Mosasaurus hoffmanni itself, the animal whose skull was taken by Napoleon, reached lengths of perhaps 14 to 17 meters in the largest individuals, making it one of the largest marine predators in the entire fossil record. Its skull was massive, its jaws deep and powerfully muscled, its teeth conical and strongly built. It was an animal capable of tackling large prey, including, almost certainly, other mosasaurs. But Mosasaurus, for all its size, was not alone at the top. Tylosaurus proriger from the western interior seaway of North America reached lengths of 12 to 14 meters and was built for speed as well as power. Its skull was slightly more streamlined than Mosasaurus's, its body more torpedo-shaped, suggesting a predator capable of pursuing fast-moving prey in open water. Specimens of Tylosaurus have been found with the remains of other mosasaurs, fish, and even flightless diving birds preserved in their stomach cavities, a direct window into the diet of a living animal that is extraordinary in its specificity. Hanosaurus bernardi from Belgium is estimated at similar lengths. Plotosaurus bennisoni from California was a mosasaur that appears to have been specialized for high-speed pursuit in open ocean Its body proportions and tail anatomy suggest a fast, efficient swimmer, the mosasaur equivalent of a great white shark in terms of its lifestyle. And then there is Mosasaurus conodon, and the debate over whether some of the largest fragmentary specimens of mosasaurs represent animals that may have reached or exceeded 17 meters lengths that, if confirmed, would place the largest mosasaurs among the largest predatory animals in the history of the planet. These are not animals to be imagined simply as big lizards. They are animals to be imagined as ecological forces, animals whose presence in an ecosystem restructured everything around them, whose hunting behavior shaped the evolution of the animals they preyed upon, whose population dynamics governed the flow of energy through an entire ocean. What was it like to be in the ocean with them? The Western Interior Seaway, the shallow Cretaceous Sea that divided North America, stretching from what is now the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic, at most a few hundred meters deep, warm and productive and full of life, was their home. Ammonites drifted in its upper waters, coiled and chambered, filtering plankton and hunting small prey. Schools of bonny fish moved through the water column in glittering masses. Sea turtles, some of them enormous, Archelon, the largest turtle that has ever lived, reaching nearly 5 meters in length, moved slowly through the shallows. Flightless diving birds, the Hesperornithines, swam pursuit diving after fish with powerful legs and a beak full of teeth. Pterosaurs soared above the surface, occasionally plunging to take fish near the surface. And through all of this, the mosasaurs moved. To understand how mosasaurs hunted, it helps to understand how they were built. Not just the bones, the whole animal, as best as the evidence allows us to reconstruct it. For most of the history of mosasaur science, the animals were reconstructed as essentially giant aquatic lizards. Long, sinuous bodies undulating from side to side like an oversized monitor lizard in the water. Slow and powerful but lacking the hydrodynamic refinement of the Ichthyosaurs or the flipper propulsion elegance of the Plesiosaurs. This reconstruction was based on the bones alone, which show a lizard-like body plan with paddle-modified limbs and a tail that, in most specimens, ends in a simple elongated tip. Then, in 2013, a study of an exceptionally preserved Platecarpus tympaniticus specimen changed the picture entirely. Platecarpus was a mid-sized mosasaur of the late Cretaceous, roughly 4 to 7 meters long, found commonly in the chalk deposits of Kansas and other parts of the Western Interior Seaway. The exceptional specimen preserved not just bones, but soft tissue impressions, the outlines of body structures that do not normally fossilize. And what those impressions showed was that Platecarpus had a tail that was not simply an elongated lizard tail. It was a bilobed tail fin, a structure similar in its basic architecture to the tail of a shark, with the vertebral column bending downward into the lower lobe of the fin, while soft tissue formed the upper lobe above it. This was a revelation. A mosasaur with a shark-like tail fin was not a sinuous, undulating swimmer. It was an active, efficient, high-speed swimmer, an animal capable of the kind of rapid, sustained locomotion in open water that the old reconstruction had made seem implausible. The tail fin of Platecarpus was not an adaptation for slow, benthic cruising. It was an adaptation for pursuit. Subsequent examination of other mosasaur specimens has confirmed that the bilobed tail fin was not unique to Platecarpus, but was widespread across the mosasaurid family. The implication for our understanding of mosasaur ecology is significant. These were not sluggish ambush predators lying in wait on the seafloor. They were active hunters, capable of sustained, high-speed pursuit in open water. They were the apex pursuit predators of the Cretaceous ocean, the equivalent, in ecological terms, of the great sharks and the toothed whales that dominate the modern open ocean. Further evidence for Mosasaurs' speed and agility comes from studies of their muscle attachment points. The vertebral column of Mosasaurs is highly regionalized. Different sections of the spine are clearly differentiated for different mechanical functions, in a way that is more similar to the spine of a fast-swimming fish or dolphin than to the relatively uniform spine of a slow-moving lizard. The tail region in particular shows the kind of deep, laterally compressed anatomy associated with powerful, efficient tail strokes for propulsion. Mosasaurs were built for speed, and in the Cretaceous ocean, speed was power. The senses of Mosasaurs are reconstructed from multiple lines of evidence, and the picture that emerges is of an animal with a sophisticated sensory toolkit appropriate for a large, active apex predator in a visually challenging environment. Vision was clearly important. The eyes of Mosasaurs were large. The skull is built around eye sockets of considerable diameter, and within many specimens, the sclerotic ring bones that supported the eye structure are preserved. The sclerotic rings of Mosasaurs indicate eyes that were robust and well supported, appropriate for animals that may have dived to modest depths where water pressure would otherwise deform the eyeball. The eyes faced somewhat laterally in most species, providing a wide field of view appropriate for detecting prey at distance in open water, but with enough forward overlap for some binocular depth perception at shorter ranges. Like many marine predators, Mosasaurs were almost certainly capable of good vision at the surface, where light was adequate, and tolerable vision at moderate depth, where light diminished but did not disappear. Whether any Mosasaurs were capable of the extreme deep diving implied by the enormous eyes of Optomosaurus is less clear. The Mosasaurid body plan, the relatively shallow epicontinental seas they inhabited, the prey species they appear to have favored, suggests that most Mosasaurs were hunters of the photic zone, the upper layer of the ocean where light was sufficient for active visual hunting. But vision was not the only sense available to them. Like their lizard relatives, Mosasaurs almost certainly had a well-developed chemosensory system, the equivalent of the forked tongue of a monitor lizard, used to sample chemical signals from the water. In living veranid lizards, this chemosensory system is used for tracking prey over long distances, following the chemical trail left by a potential meal through the environment. In the ocean, the same system would have been enormously valuable for detecting the chemical signatures of prey, injured animals, or carcasses from considerable distances. Evidence for this chemosensory capability in Mosasaurs comes from the anatomy of the palate, the roof of the mouth, which in several Mosasaur specimens shows features consistent with the vomeron nasal organ system that underlies chemosensory processing in squamates. This is indirect evidence, and the precise sensitivity of the Mosasaur chemosensory system is impossible to quantify from fossils alone. But the evolutionary logic is compelling. An animal descended from varanid-like ancestors in which chemosensory hunting was highly developed, returning to a marine environment in which chemical signals carry information about prey over long distances in moving water. Such an animal would have been under strong selective pressure to retain and potentially enhance its chemosensory capabilities. Mosasaurs also had a lateral line system, a mechanosensory system that detects pressure waves and vibrations in the water, similar to the lateral line systems of fish and some amphibians, which in fish is used to detect the movements of other fish in the water column, and to sense the pressure waves generated by swimming prey would have given Mosasaurs a three-dimensional map of their immediate aquatic environment that complemented the information from vision and chemosensation. Together, These sensory systems would have made mosasaurs formidable hunters across a range of environmental conditions, in clear, well-lit water near the surface, in the dimmer depths below the photic zone, and even at night, when chemical and mechanosensory information could substitute for the visual cues unavailable in darkness. The brain of the mosasaur, reconstructed from endocasts of skull material, was, as might be expected, organized along lizard-like lines rather than mammalian ones. Large olfactory bulbs, consistent with a well-developed sense of smell, optic lobes appropriate for good vision, an overall size and complexity consistent with the behavioral flexibility of a large active predator. Were mosasaurs intelligent? The question is complicated by the difficulty of defining intelligence in a way that is meaningful across very different nervous system architectures. What we can say is that mosasaurs were behaviorally complex in ways that required neural sophistication. Pursuit hunting requires the ability to predict the movements of prey, to anticipate where a fleeing fish will be in the next second, not just where it is now. Social interactions, if mosasaurs have them, require the recognition of individual conspecifics and the assessment of their behavior. Navigation across the open ocean requires some form of spatial memory and orientation capability. These are not the behavioral repertoires of a simple reflex machine. They require a brain capable of real-time processing of complex, multi-dimensional sensory information and the generation of flexible behavioral responses. Mosasaurs had such a brain. It was not a human brain, and it was not a dolphin brain. It was a mosasaur brain, something unique, shaped by its own evolutionary history and by the specific demands of being an apex predator in the Cretaceous ocean. The diversity of mosasaur feeding specializations is one of the most instructive aspects of the group's biology, because it reveals how thoroughly these animals had adapted to exploit every available niche in the Cretaceous marine ecosystem. At one extreme, the large Mosasaurus and Tylosaurus were generalist apex predators, animals with powerful jaws and robust teeth capable of tackling prey of almost any type, from large fish and sea turtles to other mosasaurs and potentially even pterosaurs. The teeth of these large species were conical and relatively uniform, built for seizing and holding prey rather than for any particular processing strategy. At the other extreme, some mosasaurs had evolved feeding specializations so precise that their tooth anatomy immediately reveals the type of prey they were targeting. Globidens, a genus of mosasaur found in the chalk deposits of Europe and North America, had teeth unlike those of any other mosasaur. Instead of the conical, pointed teeth of the generalists, globidens had teeth with rounded, dome-shaped crowns. Teeth built not for piercing or cutting, but for crushing, the prey that yields to a crushing bite rather than a piercing one is hard-shelled prey, ammonites, clams, sea urchins, the armored shells of the abundant invertebrates of the Cretaceous Sea. Globidens was a shell crusher. In a sea full of ammonites, whose shells spiraled to widths of half a meter or more, and of clams and oysters growing in dense beds on the seafloor, a mosasaur capable of processing this hard-shelled prey was exploiting a food resource that the other, piercing-toothed mosasaurs could not efficiently access. The specialized teeth were not simply different from those of other mosasaurs. They were the product of a distinct ecological pathway, an evolutionary fork in the road that led globidens into a niche where it faced less competition from its larger, more generalist relatives. Chironodines, another shell-crushing mosasaur, shows similar adaptations. Rounded, multi-cusped teeth built for crushing rather than piercing. The presence of multiple independent lineages of shell-crushing mosasaurs suggests that the niche was valuable enough to be exploited repeatedly, each time producing convergent adaptations in tooth morphology. At the other end of the feeding spectrum, some mosasaurs appear to have been specialized for fish, slender-bodied, relatively fast, with elongated jaws, and many small, sharp teeth that would have been effective for seizing slippery, fast-moving prey. Plegcarpus, the animal whose exceptional preservation revealed the shark-like tail fin, appears to have been one of these fish specialists. Relatively slender compared to the bulkier mosasaurs, with a skull built more for speed and precision than for power. And then there were the turtles. Archelon, the giant sea turtle of the western interior seaway, could exceed 4 meters in carapace length, the largest turtle that has ever lived. Its shell was not the solid, bony dome of most modern turtles, but a framework of struts covered with leathery skin, which reduced weight while still providing some protection. Whether this protection was sufficient against the largest mosasaurs is another matter. Archelon specimens have been found with damaged patterns on their shells consistent with mosasaur bites. Large, conical punctures, marks that match the dimensions and spacing of mosasaur teeth. These marks tell us directly that mosasaurs were attacking and consuming Archelon, that the largest turtle in history was prey for the apex predators of its sea. The ecological relationship between the large mosasaurs and Archelon is a reminder that the ancient ocean, for all its apparent distance from our experience, operated by the same fundamental rules as the modern one. Large, well-defended prey does not eliminate predation. It changes the calculus of predation, making attacks more costly, demanding more powerful predators, shaping the evolution of both prey and predator over millions of years of escalating adaptation. Archelon's enormous body and the partial protection of its shell were responses to predation pressure. The mosasaur's powerful jaws and bone-crushing capabilities were, in part, responses to the defensive adaptations of their prey. Evolution is a conversation. Not a designed conversation, not a purposeful one, but a conversation nonetheless. Each adaptation generating a response. Each adaptation generating a response. Each response generating. The two lineages shaping each other over geological time in the most fundamental way that two organisms can shape each other, by being what they need each other to become. The Western Interior Seaway was not the only arena in which the Mesozoic marine drama played out. The Tethys Sea, the warm, shallow ocean that stretched across the equatorial regions of the Mesozoic world, from the western margins of the Proto-Atlantic through what is now the Middle East and Central Asia to the Western Pacific, was another center of marine reptile diversity and abundance. The Tethys was, in many respects, the most productive marine environment of the Mesozoic. Warm tropical waters supported enormous plankton blooms, which fed dense communities of invertebrates, which in turn supported abundant fish populations, which supported the full cascade of larger predators. The carbonate platform environments of the Tethys, shallow, clear, sunlit seafloors, built from the accumulated shells of marine invertebrates, similar to modern coral reef systems but without the coral, were among the most biologically diverse environments the Mesozoic produced. And in these environments, the mosasaurs were abundantly represented. European chalk formations, the white chalk of the White Cliffs of Dover, the Belgian chalk, the Dutch chalk that gave Mosasaurus its name, are essentially the compressed remains of Tethyan plankton and invertebrates built up over tens of millions of years of late Cretaceous productivity. And within these chalk formations, mosasaur remains are found in abundance, preserved along with the fish, ammonites, and other animals that shared their world. The mosasaurs of the European chalk include some of the most completely known mosasaur species: Mosasaurus hoffmanni, Prognatton saturator, Hainosaurus bernhardi, and others. Bernhardi, whose skeletal material has been studied in detail for over 2 centuries. The long history of European mosasaur science has produced a body of knowledge about the anatomy and systematics of these animals that has, in recent decades, been enormously enriched by new analytical techniques and new discoveries. One of the most important recent insights from Tethyan mosasaur specimens concerns their reproductive biology. Like the Plesiosaurs, the mosasaurs are now believed to have been viviparous, giving live birth rather than laying eggs. The evidence comes from several directions. The implausibility of mosasaurs dragging their large bodies onto beaches to lay eggs, given their highly derived aquatic limb anatomy. The discovery in 2020 of a specimen of a small mosasaurid from Angola that has been interpreted as either a juvenile or a perinatal individual, suggesting that very small mosasaurs were born into the open ocean rather than hatching from eggs on a beach, and comparisons with the reproductive biology of their living relatives, including the fact that several groups of squamates have independently evolved viviparity in aquatic or semi-aquatic environments. If mosaurs gave live birth, as the evidence increasingly suggests, then the dynamics of their populations were fundamentally different from what the egg-laying model would imply. Live-bearing animals invest more in individual offspring, produce fewer offspring per reproductive event, and tend toward longer gestation periods. They tend to be animals in which individual survival matters more, and in which the behavioral and social contexts of reproduction are more complex than in animals that produce large clutches of eggs and leave them unattended. The mosasaurs that moved through the Cretaceous seas were not simply large, powerful, efficient killing machines. They were animals with lives, with the imperatives of reproduction and survival that drive all biological existence, with the social and behavioral complexity that those imperatives generate, with the ecological relationships and dependencies that connect every organism to every other organism in its environment. They were alive, fully, completely, magnificently alive, in a world that was not our world, on a timeline so remote from our own that the numbers lose meaning in seas that covered land that is now dry and mountains that are now eroded to nothing. Alive. And then, at the very end of the Cretaceous, the world ended for them. The end Cretaceous extinction event, triggered by the impact of a large bolide at Chicxulub on the Yucatan Peninsula approximately 66 million years ago, eliminated the mosasaurs as completely and as rapidly as it eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs on land. The extinction was not gradual for the mosasaurs. The latest mosasaur specimens in the fossil record come from sediments deposited right at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the thin layer of clay enriched in iridium that marks the moment of impact around the world. Below the boundary, mosasaurs. Above it, none. The speed of the extinction reflects the speed of the ecological collapse that the impact triggered, the chain of events that began with the impact, the ejecta cloud that blocked sunlight globally, the rapid cooling, the collapse of photosynthesis, the failure of the food chain from the bottom up would have been catastrophic for large, warm-blooded apex predators in a relatively short period of time. A mosasaur required a great deal of food as a large animal with an active metabolism. The evidence suggests that at least some mosasaurs were ectothermic in some respects, but maintained elevated body temperatures through their large size and active lifestyle, a condition called gigantothermy. It needed continuous caloric input to sustain itself. When the food chain that provided that input began to collapse, the mosasaurs faced a crisis with no solution. They could not adapt quickly enough. Evolution operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years. The collapse that followed the Chicxulub impact operated on timescales of months to years. The mismatch between the speed of the environmental change and the speed of evolutionary response is the fundamental reason why no large marine reptile survived the end Cretaceous event. The sea that existed after the impact was for a period of thousands to tens of thousands of years a fundamentally impoverished place. The great plankton blooms were gone. The ammonites, which had been one of the most abundant and diverse groups of marine invertebrates for over 300 million years, were wiped out entirely, not a single species surviving. The complex food webs that had sustained the mosasaurs, the plesiosaurs, the marine turtles, and the vast diversity of Cretaceous fish were unraveled from the foundation. Into this impoverished ocean, the survivors, the small, the flexible, the low energy, began slowly to rebuild. The mosasaurs did not get to see this recovery. They were gone before it began. The mosasaurs and plesiosaurs are the most famous inhabitants of the ancient seas, but they were not alone. The Mesozoic ocean was populated by a remarkable diversity of other reptilian lineages, each of which has its own story, its own evolutionary trajectory, its own ecological innovations, its own endpoint in extinction or in the lineages that carry forward today. Some of these other groups are little known outside of specialist paleontology. They deserve to be better known because the story of life in the Mesozoic ocean is not the story of 2 or 3 famous groups. It is the story of an entire biosphere, complex and interconnected, built over hundreds of millions of years, and then dismantled in the geological equivalent of an instant. Among the earliest and most fascinating of the Mesozoic marine reptiles were the placodonts, a group of Triassic marine reptiles whose body plan was unlike anything before or since. Placodonts were stout, heavily built animals, some of them armored, whose most distinctive feature was their teeth. The teeth of placodonts were not the sharp, conical structures of predators. They were flat, rounded, button-like, in some species, arranged in broad, paved surfaces across both the upper and lower jaws and on the palate. They were teeth built for one specific purpose: crushing. Placodonts were durophages, animals specialized for eating hard-shelled prey in the warm, shallow Tethyan seas of the Triassic, where dense beds of bivalves, brachiopods, and other hard-shelled invertebrates covered the seafloor. A reptile capable of efficiently processing this hard-shelled prey had access to an enormous food resource that most other predators could not exploit. The placodonts filled this niche with what appears, from the fossil evidence, to have been considerable success. They diversified into multiple lineages, persisted through the Triassic, and produced some of the most extraordinarily adapted body forms in all of Mesozoic marine life. The later placodonts, the Siamodontoids, had taken the body plan in a direction that is almost surreal. Henotus cheliops, from the late Triassic of Germany, was a placodont that had independently evolved a turtle-like shell, a broad, flat armor of bony plates, covering the back and belly, supporting a body that was wide and flat and moved slowly through the shallow water with 4 relatively short limbs. It looked, to a modern eye, almost exactly like a turtle, despite being entirely unrelated to turtles, despite having evolved its shell independently, despite representing a completely different branch of the reptile family tree. This is one of the most dramatic examples of convergent evolution in the fossil record. 2 entirely separate lineages, separated by their entire evolutionary history, arriving at virtually identical body plans through completely independent paths. The same environmental pressure, the need to carry hard shell armor while living in shallow water, producing the same solution from completely different starting points. Placodont's did not survive into the Jurassic. They went extinct at the end of the Triassic, in the mass extinction event that also eliminated a large proportion of Triassic terrestrial life. Their ecological role, the crushing of hard-shelled invertebrates in shallow marine environments, was subsequently filled by other animals, including, eventually, the shell-crushing Mosasaurs of the Cretaceous. Different animals, same niche, separated by over 100 million years of geological time. The Nothosaurs were another Triassic marine reptile group, long-bodied, long-necked animals that are in some ways intermediate between terrestrial reptiles and the fully marine plesiosaurs that would succeed them. Nothosaurs retained more functional limbs than the later plesiosaurs and were probably capable of moving on land as well as in water. Semi-aquatic animals, perhaps comparable in lifestyle to modern sea lions, spending time both in the ocean and on shore. Their long, fish-catching jaws and interlocking teeth identify them as active fish hunters in the coastal and shallow marine environments they inhabited. The Nothosaurs are important paleontologically because they are likely ancestral or closely related to the ancestors of the Plesiosaurs. The transition from Nothosaur to Plesiosaur, from semi-aquatic limb-walking hunter to fully marine, flipper-propelled, oceanic predator, is one of the major evolutionary transitions in Mesozoic marine life, and the Nothosaurs preserve something of the intermediate state, a window into the process of secondary marine adaptation as it was happening. Among the most spectacular of the non-plesiosaurian, non-mosasaurian marine reptiles were the Thalatocea, the crocodile relatives that adapted to life in the sea during the Jurassic and produced some of the most improbably graceful predators the ocean has ever seen. The Thalatoceusians, specifically the Metriorhynchid subfamily, were crocodilians that had abandoned the terrestrial world so completely that they had lost the armor that covers the backs of all other crocodilians, had modified their limbs into flippers, and had developed a shark-like tail fin for propulsion. The result was a crocodilian that looked almost nothing like a modern crocodile. Sleek, unarmored, hydrodynamically refined, a pursuit predator in the open Jurassic Sea rather than an ambush predator at the water's edge. Geosaurus giganteus, a Metriorhynchid from the late Jurassic of Germany and France, reached lengths of perhaps 4 to 5 meters and had a skull built for catching large, fast-moving prey. Long, narrow jaws with laterally compressed, serrated teeth more reminiscent of a predatory fish than of the thick-toothed crocodilians from which it was descended. This tooth form, known as xiphodont, is adapted for cutting through flesh for slice and tear predation rather than the grip and drown strategy of modern crocodilians. Dacosaurus andiniensis, from the late Jurassic of Argentina, nicknamed Godzilla by the researchers who studied it, had an unusually deep, short skull for a Metriorhynchid, Where most members of the family had long, narrow jaws for fish catching, Dacosaurus had a skull built for power, deep-rooted teeth, massive jaw muscles, the anatomy of an animal that tackled large, struggling prey in the ecosystem it inhabited, the shallow Tethyan seas along the western margin of the South American Tethys. Dacosaurus may have occupied an apex predator role comparable to that of the large plesiosaurids in other Jurassic seas. The Thalattosuchians did not survive the Jurassic-Cretaceous boundary. They went extinct in the early Cretaceous approximately 130 million years ago for reasons that are not entirely clear. Their disappearance left ecological space that was subsequently filled by the diversifying Mosasaurs and by the large Plesiosaurs that continued into the early Cretaceous. The succession of groups in the ancient ocean, Plagiodonts replaced by shell-crushing Mosasaurs, Thalattosuchians replaced by large Mosasaurs, Ichthyosaurs replaced by later Plesiosaurs, and then by Mosasaurs, is not a story of linear progress, of each successive group being obviously superior to the one that came before. It is a story of ecological opportunity and evolutionary response. When a niche is vacated by extinction, by environmental change, by competition, other lineages respond, diversifying to fill the available space. The ocean does not tolerate empty niches for long. Life finds a way into every available space, every available resource, every available opportunity. This principle, ecological replacement, the filling of vacated niches by new lineages, is one of the most fundamental patterns in the history of life. It operated in the Mesozoic ocean as clearly as anywhere in the fossil record, and understanding it is essential for understanding the ancient seas, not as a collection of individual spectacular animals, but as an ecosystem, a community of interacting organisms whose evolution was shaped as much by their relationships with each other as by their relationships with their physical environment. The individual stories preserved in Mesozoic marine fossils are among the most compelling in all of paleontology because they take us out of the realm of species-level abstractions and into the reality of individual lives, individual moments, individual dramas played out in the ancient ocean. Consider the specimen known as the Holzmaden ichthyosaur, one of several ichthyosaur specimens from the famous Jurassic Lagerstätte of Holzmaden, Germany, where exceptional preservation in anoxic, fine-grained sediment has captured details of soft tissue and body outline that would normally be lost to decay. Some of these specimens preserve not just the adult animal but the remains of offspring, either in the process of being born or preserved in the body cavity in positions consistent with gestation. The Stenopterygius specimen that preserves a fetus partially emerged from the birth canal is a moment frozen in rock, an animal in the act of giving birth, preserved at the instant of death in a state of vulnerability that the scale and power of the living ichthyosaur makes almost poignant. This was a living animal, warm and moving and engaged in one of the most fundamental biological acts. At the moment it became a fossil, what happened? The most likely explanation is that the mother died during birth, a complication of the birthing process, perhaps, or some other cause of death that coincided with a moment of biological vulnerability. The body sank to the anoxic seafloor of a Jurassic lagoon, where the absence of oxygen and the fine-grained sediment combined to prevent the decay and scavenging that would normally have destroyed the soft tissues, and preserved instead this extraordinary record of a life ending at the moment of a new life beginning. The pathos of this moment, if we allow ourselves to feel it, which science traditionally cautions against, but which is, in its own way, a legitimate response to evidence about real events that happened to real animals is real. This was a mother. The offspring was real. The death was real. The preservation that allows us to see it 68 million years later is as extraordinary as anything in the fossil record. Or consider the specimen known as the stomach contents mosasaur, a Tylosaurus specimen from the Cretaceous chalk of Kansas in which the preserved remains of several different animals were found in the gut region. A fish, a small mosasaur, a diving bird, a small shark. These are the last meal of an individual Tylosaurus, preserved by the same exceptional chalk preservation that has given us so much of what we know about Western interior seaway paleontology. This animal, on the day it died, had eaten several other animals of different species, of different sizes, caught presumably at different times during its recent hunting excursions. It was a full predator at the peak of its ecological role, functioning as the apex of a complex food web. And then it died, from what cause we cannot know, and sank and was preserved. And 66 million years later, its last meals became data points in the scientific reconstruction of a lost ecosystem. These are not abstract scientific specimens. They are records of specific moments in the lives of specific animals, and the ability of paleontology to recover these moments imperfectly, incompletely, but genuinely from the rock that preserved them is one of the most remarkable aspects of the science. The past is not entirely gone. It leaves traces, and with sufficient care and sufficient technique, those traces can be read. The relationship between the Mesozoic marine reptiles and the world above the water's surface is another dimension of their existence that deserves attention. Marine reptiles breathed air. This is fundamental. However adapted they were to the ocean, however hydrodynamically refined, however powerful their muscles, however well calibrated their senses, for the underwater world, they were bound to the surface by the requirement for oxygen. Every dive ended with a return to breathe. Every hunting excursion below the surface was timed by the respiratory demands of an air-breathing body. For ichthyosaurs, which appear to have been capable of deep diving, the dive physiology required to stay submerged for long periods was probably similar in principle to that of modern diving vertebrates. Slowed heart rate, preferential circulation to the brain and heart, elevated blood oxygen carrying capacity, possibly elevated myoglobin in the muscles to store oxygen for use during the dive. These adaptations are inferred partly from the physiology of the bone tissue and partly from the deep diving behavioral inference that the eye anatomy implies. For the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, which appear to have been shallower divers in most cases, the dive physiology was probably less extreme, more similar to that of a modern sea turtle or a sea lion than to a sperm whale. But even shallow diving requires physiological coordination that goes beyond simple swimming. The transition between the surface world and the underwater world, repeated many times a day throughout the life of a marine reptile, was a defining feature of their existence. The surface itself was not simply a place to breathe. It was a boundary between the underwater world, where the animal was most at home, and the aerial world above, which the animal experienced briefly and regularly, but did not inhabit. The sight of a mosasaur breaking the surface of the western interior seaway to breathe, the enormous head rising from the water, the lungs filling with warm Cretaceous air, the eyes briefly exposed to a sky crossed by pterosaurs, is a moment that bridges the underwater and aerial worlds of the Mesozoic in a way that is easy to forget when studying bones in a museum. The surface was also, for mosasaurs at least, potentially a hunting zone. Some mosasaur species appear to have been capable of taking prey at or near the surface. The flightless diving birds of the Cretaceous, the hesperornithanes, were aquatic animals that needed to breathe and likely spend time near the surface where they would have been vulnerable to a mosasaur rising from below. The pterosaurs that soared above the seaway, occasionally plunging to take fish, were also potentially vulnerable to attack from below during their surface excursions. There is fossil evidence suggesting that large mosasaurs attacked Pteranodon, one of the largest parasaurs of the western interior seaway, with a wingspan of up to 9 meters. Pteranodon bones from the chalk have been found with damage patterns consistent with mosasaur bites, suggesting that these enormous flying reptiles were not entirely safe, even in the air, above a sea occupied by the largest predators of the Cretaceous. The image of a pteranodon soaring above the warm Cretaceous sea, its vast wings catching the thermals rising from the heated water surface, and somewhere below it, 30 feet beneath the surface, a Tylosaurus tracking its shadow with upturned eyes. This is not Hollywood invention. It is a scenario that the fossil evidence makes genuinely plausible. The ancient seas were not isolated worlds. They were connected to the sky above, to the land at the shoreline, to the geological forces that were constantly reshaping the coastlines and changing the chemistry of the water. The marine reptiles were embedded in all of these connections, breathing air, occasionally venturing near shores, caught in the same geological and climatic processes that shaped the entire Mesozoic world. They were not separate from the world. They were part of it. The question of how these animals communicated, how they found mates, how they recognized individuals of their own species, how they interacted socially, is one of the most difficult in Mesozoic marine paleontology, because behavior rarely fossilizes directly. But inference is possible, and the inferences are interesting. Modern marine reptiles, sea turtles, marine iguanas, saltwater crocodiles have varying degrees of social behavior, from the relatively asocial sea turtle to the more complex social dynamics of the crocodilians. The living relatives of the Mesozoic marine groups provide some guidance, though with the caveat that convergent evolution in the marine environment may have produced behavioral patterns quite different from those of living relatives that remained terrestrial. The plesiosaurs, with their evidence for live birth and potentially for parental care, were probably the most socially complex of the major Mesozoic marine groups, at least in the context of reproduction. Animals that invest heavily in individual offspring, that carry them to a late stage of development before birth, and that are exposed during this process to the same predation pressures as any other large marine animal, tend to develop social or behavioral strategies for protecting that investment. Whether plesiosaurs formed pair bonds, maintained family groups, or gathered in loose aggregations for protection is beyond what the fossil record directly tells us. But the biology is consistent with more complex social arrangements than the simple solitary model that was assumed for so long. Mosasaurs, as lizard relatives, provide a different set of inferences. Modern monitor lizards, the closest living analogs, are largely solitary predators, though they do engage in complex social interactions during the mating season, including combat between males and elaborate courtship behaviors. If mosasaurs retained something of this behavioral repertoire in a marine context, their social interactions may have been most intense and most complex during breeding periods, with solitary hunting behavior dominating the rest of the year. The scale of mosasaur society, whether these animals aggregated in breeding grounds Whether juveniles and adults occupied different environments, as many sharks do, whether there was any social structure beyond the individual encounter, is beyond what current evidence can resolve. But the questions are real, and the answers, when they come, will come from the combination of more fossil evidence and more sophisticated behavioral inference from living analogs. What we can say with confidence is that the Mesozoic ocean was not inhabited by simple automatons. The animals that moved through those ancient seas were behaviorally complex, capable of learning, of responding to their social environment, of engaging in the full range of behaviors that large, active, cognitively sophisticated predators engage in. They were alive in the full sense. Alive and aware and embedded in a world of relationships with their prey, their competitors, their potential mates, their offspring, that made their existence something richer and more interesting than a simple catalog of anatomical features would suggest. The science of Mesozoic marine reptiles is not a finished story. It is a story being written in real time by researchers working on 4 continents, using techniques that would have been unimaginable to the scientists who first described these animals in the 19th century. New discoveries continue to reshape the picture. In Morocco, the phosphate deposits of the Old Abdoun Basin have been producing, for decades, some of the most spectacular late Cretaceous marine fossils in the world. Mosasaurus specimens of extraordinary completeness. New species, animals with anatomical features that complicate the clean narratives that had seemed to be emerging from the North American and European record. Among the most remarkable finds from Morocco is Ichthyosaurus nopesi, a relatively small mosasaur that appears to preserve transitional features between terrestrial lizards and fully marine mosasaurs. A snapshot of the transition to marine life at a later stage than Dallosaurus, adding another data point to the increasingly detailed picture of how the mosasaurid body plan evolved. In Antarctica, fossil sites that can be accessed only during brief summer field seasons and at enormous logistical cost are yielding marine reptile remains from the late Cretaceous that are reshaping our understanding of the geographic distribution of Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs in the final stages of the Mesozoic. Antarctica in the late Cretaceous was not the frozen, ice-covered continent it is today. It was a cool but productive marine environment with coastlines and shallow seas that supported a diversity of large marine animals. The elasmosaurid Plesiosaurs, represented by Antarctic Cretaceous, represented by remarkable specimens, including the large-bodied Arstenectes, were distinctive enough from their North American and European relatives to suggest a degree of geographic isolation and independent evolution. In Chile and Argentina, the Neuquén Basin and related formations have produced some of the most important marine reptile fossils from the southern hemisphere, including the magnificent metrorhynchid thalatosutians like Dacosaurus andiniensis, whose unusual skull prompted the Godzilla nickname, and plesiosaur material of considerable scientific value. The South American record of Mesozoic marine reptiles is still being developed, and each new field season adds new species and new dimensions to the picture. And in England, the fossil beds of the Jurassic coast, the stretch of coastline in Dorset and Devon that has been producing marine reptile fossils since the early 19th century, when Mary Anning began her extraordinary career as a fossil hunter on the beaches of Lyme Regis, continue to yield new material, the spirit of Mary Anning, who discovered the first described ichthyosaur skeleton as a child and who spent decades extracting and preparing fossils from the Jurassic rocks of the English coast, is present in every new find from these beds. Her contribution to the science, not just the specimens she found, but the careful observation and preparation that made them scientifically useful, is one of the great stories of the history of natural history, and it is directly connected to the science discussed in this documentary. The Jurassic Coast fossils continue to surprise. New species of Ichthyosaur are still being described from material collected from these beaches, sometimes from specimens that have been in museum collections for decades, but that modern analytical techniques allow to be recognized as something distinct from previously known species. The rock continues to give, the science continues to grow. One of the most active frontiers in Mesozoic marine reptile research concerns the physiology of these animals. Specifically, the question of whether they were ectothermic or endothermic, cold-blooded or warm-blooded, and what the answer to this question means for how we understand their ecology and behavior. For most of the history of the science, Mesozoic marine reptiles were assumed to be ectotherms, animals whose body temperature was determined primarily by the temperature of the surrounding water, as in modern reptiles. This assumption was partly driven by their classification as reptiles and partly by the pre-revolutionary understanding of dinosaur physiology that prevailed before the 1980s and 1990s. The revolution in dinosaur physiology, the establishment of warm-bloodedness in the non-avian dinosaurs, created pressure to re-examine the physiology of other Mesozoic reptile groups. If the dinosaurs on land were warm-blooded, were the marine reptiles in the sea warm-blooded too? The question has been addressed using multiple lines of evidence. Isotopic analysis, specifically the measurement of oxygen, isotope ratios in fossil teeth and bones, has been used to infer body temperatures in Ichthyosaurs, Plesiosaurs, and Mosasaurs. The results have been consistent and striking. In multiple studies across multiple species, the isotopic signatures suggest that these animals maintained body temperature significantly above the ambient water temperature, body temperatures in the range of 30 to 35 degrees Celsius in some studies, similar to those of modern birds and mammals. This does not necessarily mean these animals had the same metabolic strategy as birds and mammals. Gigantothermy, the maintenance of a stable elevated body temperature through large body size and high metabolic heat production, rather than through the high rate endothermy of birds and mammals, is a plausible mechanism for large marine reptiles. A very large animal with a relatively low metabolic rate can maintain a nearly constant body temperature simply because its large thermal mass buffers it against the temperature fluctuations of the environment. Modern leatherback sea turtles, which can maintain body temperatures 10 degrees or more above the ambient water temperature, appear to use this mechanism. Some ichthyosaur studies have suggested that the smallest ichthyosaur species may have had body temperatures closer to the ambient water temperature, while the largest were more thermally elevated, a pattern consistent with gigantothermy. Other studies have argued for a more active, metabolically driven thermoregulation, more similar to true endothermy. The resolution of this debate matters for our understanding of the behavior and ecology of these animals in important ways. A fully endothermic mosasaur, maintaining a high and constant body temperature through active metabolic heat production, would have been capable of sustained high-speed activity in cold water. It would have been, in ecological terms, something like a large shark, but with better sensory systems, greater agility, and potentially greater cognitive complexity. An ectothermic mosasaur would have been limited by the temperature of the water in its activity levels and geographic range, preferring warm tropical waters and becoming less active in cooler conditions. The isotopic evidence currently leans toward some degree of elevated body temperature in the large Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs, suggesting that these animals were not constrained to warm water in a way that a purely ectothermic animal would be. This is consistent with the geographic distribution of mosasaur fossils, which extends into high-latitude regions that, even in the warm Cretaceous, were relatively cool. An ectotherm would not have been abundant and diverse at high latitudes. An animal with some degree of thermal regulation could have been. The physiology of Mesozoic marine reptiles is a genuinely open question, and the answer, when it comes, will have implications that extend well beyond the animals themselves. The distribution of warm-bloodedness across the vertebrate tree of life is one of the central questions in evolutionary biology, with implications for our understanding of metabolism, ecology, and the long-term trajectory of vertebrate evolution. There is a question about the ancient seas that science has only recently begun to seriously engage. What did these worlds look like from the perspective of the animals that lived in them? This is not a question about consciousness, exactly. Not the hard philosophical problem of what it is like to be another kind of mind. It is a more tractable question about the sensory and cognitive world that these animals inhabited, the information they processed, the patterns they recognized, the behaviors that information triggered. We have touched on this throughout the documentary, the vision of Toplomosaurus adapted for deep water darkness, the chemosensory capability of Mosasaurs, tracking prey by scent, the acoustic sensitivity of Plesiosaurs in a water-filled world where sound travels farther and faster than through air. But putting these pieces together into something like a coherent picture of how these animals experienced their world is one of the most challenging and most rewarding intellectual exercises in paleontology. Consider a pleosaurid, Leopleurodonce, or Plesiosaurus, moving through the late Jurassic Sea in search of prey. Its eyes scan the water around it, reading the light that filters down from the surface above and the bioluminescent flickers of smaller creatures in the water column below. Its chemosensory system, the equivalent of a monitor lizard's tongue, sampling the water for molecular signals, is continuously drawing in information about the chemical environment. The faint traces of blood from an injured fish 200 meters away, the chemical signature of a breeding female of its own species somewhere in the middle distance, the metabolic byproducts of the dense ammonite shoal it passed through earlier, its lateral line, the mechanosensory system that detects pressure waves in the water, is reading the physical disturbance patterns generated by everything that moves within range. A school of fish 200 meters ahead produces a pressure wave that the lateral line detects as a directional signal, a gentle push in the water that carries information about the size, speed, and direction of the school. Something larger, an ichthyosaur moving at speed to the left, produces a different signature, stronger and more coherent, that the plesiosaur's nervous system interprets as something that might be prey or might be competition. All of this information arrives continuously, processed by a brain that is, by the standards of a marine predator in the Jurassic, sophisticated and well-organized. The plesiosaur does not deliberate in any sense we would recognize as deliberation, but it does orient. It does make decisions. This direction, not that one. This prey, not that one. This moment to accelerate, not that one. The decisions are driven by sensory information processed through neural circuits that were shaped over millions of years of evolution to produce behaviors that, on average, led to successful predation and successful reproduction. The experience of being a pliosaurid, if experience is the right word, was a continuous engagement with a three-dimensional sensory world of extraordinary richness, filtered through a nervous system calibrated precisely for the specific challenges of hunting in the Jurassic Ocean. It was not a human experience. It was not even vaguely like a human experience, but it was an experience in the sense that something was happening. Information was being processed. Behaviors were being generated. The animal was moving through the world in a way that reflected an ongoing engagement with the world rather than a passive response to it. This is what it means to say that these animals were alive, not simply that their hearts were beating and their muscles were moving. Alive in the sense that they were present in their world, perceiving it, responding to it, engaged with it, moment to moment, in the way that only a complex nervous system can engage with an environment. The ancient ocean was full of this kind of presence, full of animals that were present in their worlds in this way. From the smallest ammonite filtering plankton in the surface water to the largest Plesiosaurid moving through the depths below, the Jurassic and Cretaceous seas were inhabited by beings that were engaged with their existence in some way that we can partially reconstruct and only partially understand. This is not a mystical claim. It is a biological one, and it is the most important thing to understand about these animals. More important, in a sense, than their anatomy or their systematics or their stratigraphic range. They were alive, really, genuinely, fully alive, and the oceans they inhabited were real, functioning ecosystems of extraordinary complexity and beauty. They are gone now. The last Plesiosaur died 66 million years ago. The last Mosasaur, the last Ichthyosaur, all gone in the same geological instant that took the non-avian dinosaurs and the pterosaurs and the ammonites. Gone so completely that not a single representative of any of these groups survives in any form. This is different from the fate of the dinosaurs, some of whose lineage the birds survived and flourishes today. The marine reptiles left no descendants. The Plesiosaur family tree ends without a branch that continues to the present. The Mosasaurs' nearest living relatives are the monitor lizards and the snakes, but these are cousins, not direct descendants. The Mosasaurs themselves are simply gone. There is something in this total extinction, the ending of an entire evolutionary experiment, the disappearance of body plans and adaptations and ecological roles that had existed for 150 million years. That invites reflection on the contingency of existence, on how thoroughly the living world can be reorganized by a single catastrophic event, on how much has been lost in the geological history of the Earth that we will never know. The ancient ocean is gone. The animals that ruled it are gone. The sea itself has changed. Its chemistry, its temperature, its currents, its biological community, beyond any simple comparison with the ocean of today. What we have are the rocks, the bones within the rocks, the information that careful science can extract from those bones, building slowly and imperfectly toward an understanding of a world that ended before the first human ancestor walked the African savanna. And yet the rocks are enough. The bones are enough. They're enough to tell us that this world existed, that for 150 million years, the ancient ocean was ruled by animals of extraordinary size and power and biological sophistication. That the Mosasaur was real, that the Plesiosaur swam and hunted and gave live birth and possibly cared for its young in a warm Cretaceous sea, that the Ichthyosaur had the largest eyes of any vertebrate, adapted to see in the darkness below the photic zone, and that the colors of its skin, dark above, light below, have been recovered from chemistry preserved in 68-million-year-old rock. The bones are enough to tell us all of this, and all of this together is enough to make the ancient ocean a place of genuine wonder, not the wonder of fantasy or mythology, of sea monsters invented to populate the margins of maps, but the wonder of reality, of something that was actually there, of something that was real in every sense of the word: physical, biological, ecological, experiential. The last thing to consider tonight is why this matters. Why the ancient ocean and the animals that ruled it should occupy any space in the thinking of people living in the 21st century. People who have never seen the Western Interior Seaway or the Tethys Sea or the Jurassic Epicontinental Sea of Western Europe. The most direct answer is the one that applies to all of natural history, because the past is the context of the present. The ocean that exists today is not the first ocean. It is the latest in a long series of marine worlds, each one shaped by the biology and geology of what came before, each one in turn shaping what comes after. The extinction of the Mosasaurs and Plesiosaurs 66 million years ago opened the ecological space that the modern cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, subsequently filled. The dolphins are not the Mosasaurs reborn, but they are doing a similar job in a similar environment, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that shaped the Mosasaurs and the similarities between them. The hydrodynamic body form, the social complexity, the large brain, the echolocation systems are the result of those shared pressures operating on different starting materials over different timescales, over different. Understanding what came before helps us understand what is here now. The living ocean makes more sense when seen in the context of the ancient ocean. The adaptations of living marine predators are more comprehensible when viewed against the backdrop of the Mesozoic marine reptiles that occupied the same ecological roles before them. The rules of the ocean, the physics of fluid dynamics, the ecology of predator-prey relationships, the evolutionary logic of secondary marine adaptation are the same rules that governed the ancient sea. Understanding those rules, as illustrated by the extraordinary organisms of the Mesozoic, enriches our understanding of the ocean in which those rules continue to operate today. The second answer is more personal. It has to do with the experience of deep time, the experience of sitting with the knowledge that the world has been here for a very long time, that it has contained wonders of which we are not always aware, that existence is larger and stranger and more various than any single moment of looking at it can capture. The mosasaur swam in a sea that is now the chalk of the English countryside, the limestone of the Kansas Badlands, the phosphate rock of the Moroccan desert. The plesiosaur gave birth in water that is now the dry land of Montana. The ichthyosaur dove with its enormous eyes into the dark of a Jurassic sea that has long since been subducted, recycled, transformed into the rock of mountains that no longer exist. All of this happened. All of it was real, and the traces of it, the bones, the teeth, the skin impressions, the chemistry preserved in ancient rock, are still here, waiting to be found and studied and understood. This is the gift of the fossil record, not just the data it contains, though the data is extraordinary, but the experience it offers, the experience of knowing that the world is deep and old and full of things that were real long before we were here to see them, and that the practice of careful observation and honest thinking can, across all that time, recover something of what those things were. The ancient ocean is gone, but it is not entirely gone. It lives in the rock. It lives in the science built on that rock. And tonight, In this telling of its story, it lives for a little while longer. A world of giants moving through warm ancient water, hunting and breathing and living under a sky, a world that was real. Rest now. The sea is old tonight, older than you can feel, older than language or memory, older than anything the mind can hold at once. And somewhere in its depths, not the depths of today, but the depths of a time so remote it barely has a name, enormous shapes are moving through warm, dark water. Not slowly, not clumsily, with the precision and the power of animals perfectly made for the world they inhabit. The Plesiosaurid turns in the deep water, orienting toward the pressure wave of something large and worth pursuing. The Elasmosaurid drifts with the current, its long neck hanging in the water, its small eyes watching the pale shapes of fish moving above it. The Mosasaur breaks the surface. Just for a moment, just long enough to breathe, and slips back beneath, and slips back beneath, and the ripple it leaves expands in circles across the warm Cretaceous sea until it reaches the shore and is absorbed into the sand of a beach that no human foot will ever touch. The ancient ocean is quiet around them. Sleep now. The giants are swimming. The sea is old and full and warm. And the world, even in the dark, is full of life.